The first time Oskar Schindler stepped onto Polish soil, he felt the hum of opportunity buzzing in his veins. The streets of Krakow were gray and cracked, lined with buildings that carried the scars of a world at war. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the muted cries of the city echoed through alleys where soldiers marched, boots striking cobblestones with an oppressive rhythm. To anyone else, it was a city under siege, a land of suffering and fear. But to Schindler, it was a place teeming with possibilities, a place where a clever man could make a fortune while the world around him burned. He was a man in his early 30s, charismatic, impeccably dressed, and armed with a smile that could charm both soldiers and businessmen alike. Oskar's mind worked in perpetual motion, calculating risks, profits, and angles. To him, the war was not a tragedy, at least, not yet. It was a canvas. He had come to Poland with a single goal, wealth. And he would seize it with the same determination he applied to every deal he ever made. Schindler had heard about the Krakow ghetto, a place where thousands of Jews were forced into squalid, overcrowded conditions. He had read the reports, glanced at photographs, and dismissed them as background noise, collateral in the grand scheme of profit. He needed workers for his enamelware factory, and the ghetto provided them at the cheapest possible rate. Jewish men and women, skilled or unskilled, were desperate, and desperation lowered wages. It was, he thought, an ideal arrangement. His factory, once secured, was modest in size but strategically located near the ghetto. The building itself smelled of paint and metal, of fresh enamel coating over raw steel. Schindler walked through the empty halls, imagining machines clattering, sparks flying, and workers bending over assembly lines. He pictured the profits, the contracts, the prestige that would come from producing goods for the German army. Every corner, every beam, every bare wall became a part of his dream of wealth. The first workers arrived in a line, guarded by Nazi soldiers, their faces pale and anxious. They were not the figures of industry Schindler had imagined. They were human, and human in a way he had not anticipated. Their eyes carried exhaustion, fear, and a quiet resignation to a life no longer their own. He watched them shuffle forward, dragging heavy bags, clutching the few possessions they had managed to save. The sight stirred something faint, almost imperceptible, in his chest, but he ignored it. Profit, he reminded himself. Profit first, morality later. He greeted them with charm, shaking hands, nodding, pretending to care. Some smiled back cautiously, others avoided eye contact entirely. Schindler made jokes about work conditions, promising fair wages, though he knew very few would see any real benefit. He had already calculated his margins, and the numbers thrilled him more than the people before him. The machinery would turn, the paint would dry, and the coins would pour into his pocket. The world outside the factory walls, full of war and death, was irrelevant to a man like him until it wasn't. At first, the factory operated exactly as Schindler had planned. Machines hummed, enamel-coated pots and pans slid down the assembly line, and he collected contracts from German officers eager to outfit their troops. The ghetto's labor was cheap, compliant, and replaceable. Schindler made his rounds, inspecting machines, sipping wine, and shaking hands. He enjoyed the admiration of Nazi officials, the respect of local businessmen, and the envy of those who had yet to recognize his cunning. Life, in these first months, seemed simple. But simplicity is fragile, especially in a world governed by chaos. The first cracks appeared quietly, almost imperceptibly. He began to notice the bruises on men's arms, the hollow look in women's eyes, the children peering from the ghetto walls with curiosity and hunger. One morning, he saw a young boy clutching a loaf of bread, running through the streets as a German soldier barked orders and swung his baton. The boy fell, scraped his knees, and scrambled to his feet, clutching the bread to his chest as though it were gold. Something about that image lodged in Schindler's mind, but he pushed it aside. He was, after all, a businessman. Sympathy was a distraction. It was during one of these mornings, walking through the outskirts of the ghetto, that he first saw her, a little girl in a bright red coat, standing amidst the sea of grey and black that made up the other refugees. She was not more than 8 or 9, her eyes wide and terrified, but there was something stubborn about her stance. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She simply watched him, as though daring the world to move her. Schindler turned away quickly, unwilling to confront the weight of the recognition that every life here was precious, that every loss was a personal failure. Yet, the image stayed with him, ghosting into his thoughts even as he returned to the factory floor, poring over ledgers and contracts. As months passed, Schindler became more entwined with the machinery of survival and war. He entertained German officers, hosting lavish dinners where vodka flowed freely and the clink of glasses masked the reality outside. He acquired resources, bribed officials, and navigated bureaucracies with the ease of a man born to manipulate systems. All the while, he watched his workers, noting their skill, their humanity, and their fragility. There were nights he would sit alone, listening to the distant cries from the ghetto, wondering if he could afford to ignore them any longer. The turning point came quietly, not with a dramatic confrontation, but in the small, unbearable moments that accumulate into clarity. Schindler found himself giving extra rations to workers, hiding injuries, and quietly intervening in disputes with guards. Each act was rationalized as necessary to maintain efficiency, yet with every passing day, a new thread of purpose began weaving through his heart. He began to understand that the people he employed were more than just numbers on a ledger. They were lives fragile, fleeting, and irreplaceable. The war around him intensified. Air raid sirens screamed, soldiers disappeared, and deportations became common. Schindler watched as friends, acquaintances, and even strangers vanished overnight, dragged to camps with no hope of return. He began keeping records, not for profit, but for protection, lists of names, ages, and skills. Every name he recorded was a vow, a silent promise that he would do whatever it took to save them. And in those lists, the first sparks of transformation began to take hold. The opportunist, who had come for wealth, was beginning to see the value of human life. Yet the path was far from clear. Every decision carried risk. Bribes could be refused, lies could be discovered, and a single misstep could cost him everything, or worse, cost lives. But Schindler was learning a new kind of calculation, one that did not involve money. It involved courage, patience, and a moral reckoning that no ledger could measure. He realized that wealth, fame, and comfort were meaningless in the face of human suffering. To protect those under his care, he would have to gamble everything he had, and perhaps everything he was. By the end of his first year in Krakow, Schindler had changed imperceptibly. Outwardly, he remained the charming businessman, entertaining German officers and managing production with precision. Inwardly, however, a new purpose had taken root. He had seen the worst of humanity and glimpsed the best he could offer in response. The seeds of transformation from opportunist to savior were planted, though he did not yet fully understand the magnitude of what lay ahead. As the sun set over Krakow, painting the city in streaks of orange and gold, Schindler walked along the factory floor, pausing to look at his workers. They were exhausted, bruised, and weary, but alive. For the first time, the hum of machines and the clatter of tools did not represent mere profit. They represented possibility, survival, and a fragile hope. Schindler inhaled deeply, aware that his journey had only just begun, and that the choices he made in the coming days, months, and years would define not just his life, but the lives of over 1,000 souls who depended on him. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, the image of the little girl in the red coat lingered, a silent reminder that even in the darkest times, one person's courage could alter the course of countless lives. Awakening. The city had changed since Schindler first arrived. Krakow's streets were no longer merely shadows of opportunity, they had become landscapes of horror. Smoke still rose from chimneys, but now it carried the acrid smell of despair. The once faint cries of the ghetto had become a constant, piercing echo, impossible to ignore. For the first time, Oskar felt a weight that no ledger could measure, no bribe could soothe, and no profit could erase. It started subtly. A worker, a quiet man named Itzhak, stumbled on the factory floor, his hands shaking as he dropped a stack of enamel pots. Schindler noticed the bruises forming along his forearms, deep purple and raw. When he asked, Itzhak muttered something about an officer's punishment and quickly walked away, avoiding Schindler's gaze. Something tightened in Schindler's chest, a knot of unease he couldn't shake. He had entered the city believing he could remain detached, a businessman shielded by wealth and charm. But Krakow had other plans. One evening, he received word that his factory workers had been ordered to report for special inspections outside the ghetto. Curiosity and instinct drove him to follow. He arrived just in time to see a group of soldiers herding the Jews into a narrow alley, barking orders with lethal indifference. Panic rippled through the crowd as mothers clutched their children, men tried to shield the vulnerable, and a lone violin played in the distance, hauntingly, before the music was silenced by a soldier's boot. Schindler felt bile rise in his throat. He had seen poverty before, he had seen hardship, but never such organized cruelty, so raw and intentional. And then he saw her again, the little girl in the red coat. She stood frozen, her eyes wide, staring at the soldiers as if daring them to harm her. She moved through the crowd with an eerie stillness, weaving past bodies, oblivious to chaos. Schindler couldn't look away. In that moment, he understood the magnitude of what was happening around him. Life and death were no longer abstract, they were tangible, brutal, and unavoidable. Every face he saw, every terrified glance, every tremble of a child's hand, etched itself into his consciousness. The next days were sleepless. Schindler roamed Krakow, his mind racing with questions and guilt. How could he profit from such suffering? How could he sit comfortably in his office while men, women, and children were being slaughtered merely for their identity? He began speaking quietly with his trusted factory managers, learning more about the deportations, the forced labor, and the daily brutality of the ghetto. Each story was a punch to the gut, a mother separated from her child, a father beaten for refusing an order, neighbors disappearing overnight. Schindler started subtle acts of defiance. He instructed guards to look the other way when a worker smuggled extra bread to a family. He hid small injuries, provided extra blankets, and quietly protested punishments that crossed the line of reason. At first, these were small, almost imperceptible gestures, rationalized as a way to maintain worker productivity. But every act chipped away at his old self, the opportunist who had come only for money. Slowly, the businessman transformed into something else, a man beginning to grasp the value of life, the sacredness of survival. Then came the day that crystallized his awakening. A convoy of Jews was being loaded into trucks for deportation to a camp. Schindler, having bribed a minor official to gain access, entered the scene under the pretense of inspection. The sight that greeted him was indescribable: families torn apart, screaming children, elderly trembling, some collapsing under fear. He saw mothers shielding their children with desperate arms, young men pushed to the ground, and the despair of a community hanging in the balance. Schindler's heart pounded in a way it never had before. The little girl in the red coat was there too, clutching her mother's hand, her small face streaked with dust and tears. He wanted to reach out, to stop the chaos, but the crowd, the soldiers, the world, all seemed insurmountable. And yet, a single thought anchored him: he could not be a bystander. Not anymore. Profit meant nothing if lives were being extinguished under his watch. That night, Schindler sat in his office, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. For the first time, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life: he would protect his workers at all costs. He began planning systematically, listing every person who worked in his factory, noting skills, ages, and vulnerabilities. He understood that bureaucracy was both a weapon and a shield. By presenting his workers as essential to the war effort, he could provide them a layer of protection. Over the following months, Schindler's factory became a sanctuary. He negotiated, bribed, and threatened where necessary, all to keep the Nazis from sending his workers to death camps. Guards who had once been indifferent were now manipulated by his charm, his audacity, and the authority he projected. Schindler paid for extra food, secured better living quarters, and, in some cases, falsified documents. The stakes were astronomical: a single mistake could cost him everything, and the weight of this responsibility pressed upon him constantly. Despite the growing danger, Schindler found unexpected allies. Factory managers, fellow businessmen, and even some officers began to assist quietly, either swayed by his charisma or moved by the humanity he displayed. Together, they created a fragile shield around the people in his care. It was not perfect, and it never would be, but it was enough to save lives, a line of defense in a city consumed by death. Through all of this, the red coat girl haunted him. She had survived the immediate horrors, and her image became a symbol of innocence and resilience. Schindler realized that every worker, every family, and every child had a story, a right to live. The awakening was complete. The man who had come to Krakow for money was now driven by a higher purpose. He was no longer a passive observer, he was a protector, a strategist, and, eventually, a savior. By the end of the chapter, Schindler understood that profit, influence, and comfort were meaningless in a world where lives were at stake. The war had shown him humanity at its most grotesque and most fragile, and he had chosen to act. Krakow had stripped away his detachment and revealed a core truth: one person could make a difference, and even in the darkest times, courage and ingenuity could save lives. The city outside remained dangerous, chaotic, and merciless. Yet inside the factory walls, there was a glimmer of hope. The awakening had begun. Schindler's journey from opportunist to protector had taken its first irrevocable steps, and the choices he would make in the coming days, months, and years would shape the fate of more than 1,000 souls. The list. The winter of 1944 pressed heavily on Krakow, covering the streets in a bitter frost that seemed to seep into every bone and heart. Schindler walked through the city, his coat pulled tight against the wind, but no warmth could shield him from the weight he carried. The ghetto had been emptied, and whispers of extermination camps had become reality. He had witnessed the terror firsthand: families torn apart, friends vanished, and children stolen from their mothers. The urgency of survival was no longer theoretical, it was immediate, personal, and consuming. Schindler had a plan now, a dangerous, audacious plan that would define his legacy. He would save as many lives as he could, and to do that, he needed a listed document that would become both shield and sword. The names of the workers, their skills, and their ages had to be meticulously recorded. Each name represented a life hanging by a thread, each number a silent plea against the machinery of genocide. The list would be more than paper, it would be salvation. He gathered trusted colleagues in the dim light of his office, maps and ledgers spread across the table. Together, they began the painstaking process of selecting names. Schindler's decisions were never easy. Some workers were obvious, skilled artisans whose talents could justify their presence to the Nazis. Others were chosen not for efficiency but for humanity: the elderly, the sick, the mothers whose children clung to life with fragile hands. Every choice carried risk. Any misstep, any omission, could mean death. The bureaucracy of the Third Reich became both obstacle and opportunity. Schindler learned to navigate it with cunning precision, bribing officials, falsifying documents, and exploiting loopholes. Meetings with Nazi officers were tense exercises in charm and deception. He laughed, toasted, and played the role of the loyal businessman while maneuvering behind the scenes to shield his workers. Each interaction was a gamble. A single miscalculation could lead to his arrest, or worse, the extermination of those he had promised to protect. As the list took shape, Schindler saw the human stories behind every entry. There was Mendel, a quiet man with a talent for enamel work, who dreamed of returning to his family after the war. There was Herta, a mother of 3, whose gentle hands had stitched uniforms and mended clothes under duress. Every name etched into the list was a life with history, dreams, and fear. Schindler's heart carried each of them, their fates intertwined with his own. Resistance was not merely logistical but emotional. Workers came to him in whispers, begging for their loved ones to be added. Some names on the list had to be deferred or left off entirely, a decision that weighed on Schindler like a physical burden. He grew restless at night, pacing the cold floors of his office, writing and erasing, calculating and recalculating. The act of saving lives had become a strategy of both mind and soul, and failure was not an option. The German officers became suspicious of Schindler's increasing involvement in these matters. Rumors of favoritism, of unusual leniency, began circulating through the ranks. Schindler responded with charm and confidence, deflecting suspicion with laughter, parties, and the outward appearance of normalcy. Behind the curtain, however, he orchestrated a delicate dance of deception. Bribes flowed, favors were exchanged, and intimidation was employed when necessary. It was a dangerous performance, but it was the only way to protect the people under his care. The winter deepened, and with it, the stakes. Deportations accelerated, and whispers of Auschwitz reached the factory gates. Schindler's office became a hub of silent urgency. Each name added to the list was a victory, a shield against the unimaginable. He walked among the workers, quietly assessing their health, morale, and safety. He became a figure of paradoxical authority, both feared and revered, a businessman whose influence now carried the weight of life and death. Schindler also confronted the moral and emotional cost of his choices. The list saved lives, yes, but it could not save everyone. The faces of those he could not help haunted him. Nights were spent in restless contemplation, guilt gnawing at his conscience. Yet, even in the darkest moments, he refused to abandon his mission. To falter was to betray those who had been entrusted to him, and Schindler was resolute. He had made a vow, unspoken but unwavering, to protect as many as possible. By spring, the list was nearly complete. Over 1,200 names had been recorded, a testament to meticulous planning, courage, and sheer willpower. The workers were assigned to his factory, officially deemed essential to the German war effort. The documents were checked, stamped, and verified, each one a fragile barrier against death. Schindler walked through the assembly lines, observing his workers with a mixture of pride and deep concern. They were safe for now, but the shadow of danger remained ever present. The process was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. Schindler spent long hours negotiating with Nazi officials, often dining late into the night to secure favors or bribe officers. He witnessed greed, cruelty, and corruption in every interaction, yet he remained focused, driven by the lives behind the list. Each name was a reminder that humanity could still exist amid the machinery of annihilation. Each face was proof that courage, cunning, and conscience could coexist in one man. The factory became more than a workplace, it became a sanctuary, a fragile bubble of survival. Workers who had once feared for their lives found solace in the routines of labor, the predictability of the machines, and the presence of a man willing to gamble everything for them. Schindler himself transformed further. Gone was the opportunist seeking wealth, in his place stood a man defined by moral courage, ingenuity, and an unshakable commitment to others. One evening, as the last snow melted from the streets, Schindler stood outside the factory, looking at the faces of the workers walking home. There was laughter, cautious but genuine, mingled with the clatter of pots and the hum of daily life. For the first time, he allowed himself a fleeting sense of accomplishment. The list had worked. The lives it represented were intact. And yet, he knew the war was far from over. Danger remained, unpredictable and relentless, ready to undo everything he had built. But Schindler had learned a crucial lesson: the list was more than a document. It was a symbol of resistance, a testament to human ingenuity and courage. It was proof that one person could bend the course of history, even against overwhelming odds. Every name, every life saved, every risk taken was a declaration that even in the darkest times, humanity could endure. As night fell over Krakow, the factory lights glimmered through the frost, casting shadows on the cobblestone streets. Schindler returned to his office, eyes tired but mind sharp, already thinking ahead to the challenges yet to come. The list was complete, but the mission was ongoing. Each saved life carried the weight of responsibility, and Schindler bore it willingly. For him, for the workers, and for the countless others who might have perished, the list was not merely paper, it was hope, defiance, and salvation. Legacy. The war was ending, but Krakow bore the scars of years of devastation. Buildings lay in ruins, streets were littered with debris, and the silence between the occasional explosions carried an eerie weight. The factories still hummed with life, but this life was fragile, a tenuous thread stretching across a city stitched together by fear, hope, and sheer survival. For Oskar Schindler, every day brought both relief and unease. Relief that his workers had survived, unease that the shadow of danger was never truly gone. Schindler walked through the factory, observing the men and women who had become more than employees. They were survivors, witnesses, and the living proof of what one man's courage could achieve. Faces once pale and hollow with fear now showed resilience. Children, once hidden behind doors and blankets, ran in the corridors, their laughter fragile yet defiant, echoing against the steel and concrete of the factory walls. Schindler's heart swelled with pride, yet it was tempered by the memories of those who had not made it, those whose absence haunted him in quiet moments. The Nazi regime was collapsing, its officers retreating, surrendering, or disappearing into the chaos of defeat. Schindler, once seen as a compliant industrialist, now found himself under scrutiny. He had spent years playing a dangerous game, balancing charm and bribery, courage and deception. With the Reich in disarray, his position became precarious. There were whispers of betrayal, accusations of favoritism, and lingering suspicion. Yet Schindler's focus never wavered. His mission was clear: ensure the safety and continued survival of every soul he had pledged to protect. As the Allies advanced, the world outside the factory shifted rapidly. News arrived of concentration camps being liberated, of horrors too vast to comprehend fully. Schindler received reports of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek, places where families had been destroyed in cold efficiency. The list, the document he had painstakingly compiled, became a shield against this reality, a barrier that transformed names into lives, paper into salvation. Every worker he had protected was a defiance against annihilation, a testament to his relentless commitment. The factory became a sanctuary not only for workers but for hope itself. Schindler secured additional supplies, arranging transport for those who wished to leave Krakow for safer territories. He mediated disputes, provided food and clothing, and ensured medical care. His efforts were often invisible, unnoticed by the world beyond the factory gates, but to those he protected, he was nothing short of a guardian. His actions were pragmatic yet profoundly humane, blending strategy with compassion in ways that few could imagine. Schindler's personal sacrifices grew heavier as the war drew to a close. He spent his fortune bribing officials, securing materials, and keeping his workers safe. Wealth, once a measure of success, had become irrelevant. The true value lay in lives preserved, in families kept intact, and in the fragile continuation of humanity. He lived in constant tension, the cost of failure looming with every decision. Nights were restless, filled with dreams of the lives that might have been lost, of faces he could not save, of the crushing weight of responsibility that he bore alone. Despite the immense pressure, small moments of joy persisted. Workers celebrated minor achievements, shared news of surviving relatives, and began rebuilding fractured communities. Schindler watched them with quiet satisfaction, aware that the war had taken much but had not extinguished the human spirit. In these fleeting instances, he glimpsed the profound impact of his choices. Each act of protection had multiplied into resilience, courage, and life. The end came gradually, like a tide receding to reveal the scars of its force. German forces surrendered, Krakow fell under Allied control, and the war was officially over. Schindler, however, faced a new reality. His fortune depleted, his influence waning, he was no longer the powerful industrialist he had once been. The world he had navigated with cunning and charm had shifted irreversibly. Yet, in the face of personal loss, he found solace in the knowledge that over 1,000 lives owed their survival to his decisions, his risks, and his unwavering resolve. The workers he had saved dispersed across Europe, some returning to lost families, others seeking new beginnings in lands untouched by war. Letters arrived sporadically, each one a reminder of the lives he had touched. They spoke of gratitude, of hope rekindled, and of memories that would endure long after the war had faded from headlines. Schindler kept these letters close, each one a testament to the difference one person could make in the darkest of times. As years passed, history began to recognize the magnitude of Schindler's actions. Survivors told stories of the man who had risked everything to protect them, of the factory that had become a haven, and of the courage that had defied death itself. Honors came slowly, quietly, almost reluctantly, yet they could never truly measure the impact he had. Recognition was fleeting, the lives saved were permanent. The list, once fragile paper, became a symbol of hope, ingenuity, and moral courage. Schindler himself remained modest. He never sought fame or glory. He had acted because it was necessary, because life demanded action in the face of atrocity. His reflection in the mirror showed a man altered by experience, marked by courage, and haunted by memory. He carried the weight of decisions, both the successes and the failures, knowing that history would remember him not for wealth or business acumen but for the lives he had preserved against all odds. In the quiet moments, Schindler would sometimes walk through the empty streets of Krakow, recalling faces, laughter, and tears. He thought of the little girl in the red coat, whose innocence had cut through the darkness and reminded him why action mattered. He thought of families reunited, of lives that had blossomed despite unimaginable circumstances. And he thought of the moral truth he had learned through fire and fear, that courage, compassion, and relentless ingenuity could bend history, even if only for a moment. The legacy of Oskar Schindler is not found in monuments, money, or fame. It is found in the living, breathing proof that one person's choices can resist tyranny. It is found in the generations that followed, in the children who grew up knowing their parents had been spared, in the stories passed down of survival against impossible odds. His actions became a template for moral courage, a lesson etched in the collective memory of humanity. Even as Krakow slowly healed, the echoes of the past remained. Factories hummed, streets rebuilt, and life moved forward, yet the story of Schindler endured. It endured because he had made a choice to act, to protect, and to resist evil with whatever means he had. The list, once fragile and finite, had transformed into an eternal testament to human resilience. In the end, Oskar Schindler's legacy was clear, that even in the darkest chapters of history, courage and compassion could prevail, and that one determined individual could illuminate